The topic that I chose was the effect of legal changes to a subsistence lifestyle. Native people of Alaska have for centuries depended upon the natural resources offered by the land for their existence and well-being. Not unlike other cultures, Native Alaskans have used what is available to them for subsistence. Euro-American culture has utilized technological advances, enhancing trade, and has had worker specialization and production of goods and the growing of distribution of foods for well over a century. On the contrary, Native Alaskans have not been exposed to these technologies at the same rate as much of the rest of the country. Population densities are also much greater in the contiguous 48 states when compared to Alaska. These differences coincide with a different approach to regulating and managing natural resources. The United States, through enactment of state and federal laws, has influenced Native culture's reliance on fish and wildlife. This influence has been particularly noticeable since the confirmation of significant oil deposits in the Prudhoe Bay areas of the state. From the time of contact until 1902, there were no laws involving subsistence in Alaska. In 1902, Congress passed legislation that stated, "Nothing in this act shall prevent the killing of any game animal or bird for food or clothing at any time by natives or by miners or explorers when in need of food. But the game animals or birds so killed during closed season shall not be shipped or sold." In more recent time, during the first 19 years of statehood, no user groups were defined as having preference, and fish and game were handled on a first-come, first-served basis. With the building of the Alaska oil pipeline in the 1970s, issues of subsistence came to a head and conflicts have occurred and continue to occur through present day. Discovery of significant oil reserves in the Prudhoe Bay area hastened the need for a land settlement with Native Alaskans. The desire of oil companies to build an oil pipeline crossing lands that were subject to a claim agreement became the driving force behind passage of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, or ANCSA, in December of 1971. Early drafts of ANCSA addressed subsistence and native land use. In the rush to pass ANCSA, the Senate Conference Committee dropped provisions that would have protected subsistence activities near native villages. The result was a bill signed in 1972 that did not address subsistence. Rather, it expected the Secretary of Interior in the state of Alaska to address these needs. After the building boom of the oil pipeline, Alaska came to the conclusion that subsistence would have to be protected by statute rather than by conference reports and contractual agreements. The state enacted the State Subsistence Act of 1978. This law gave priority to subsistence use of fish and game, as well as defined subsistence eligibility for all Alaska residents. The act was inadequate for Native rights because it did not protect the subsistence activities of Native Alaskans. The law allowed all Alaskans, rural and urban, to compete for the same resources. In 1980, the Alaska National Interest Land Claims Act, or ANILCA, was passed by the United States. This act contained provisions for subsistence within Title VIII, the subsistence title. The provisions were for rural residents to have subsistence priority on federal lands. It neglected to give priority to natives because the state of Alaska objected to a native preference on the basis that it was counter to the state constitution. The state constitution states that Alaska's resources will be equally available to all residents. What was agreed upon was the term rural in defining subsistence eligibility. ANILCA provided that subsistence activities would be allowed on nearly all of the 104 million acres of federal land that were a part of ANILCA. It also stated that the state of Alaska would be able to manage fish and game on federal lands if it enacted a law granting subsistence priority to rural residents in compliance with ANILCA. The state gained compliance with the 1986 Subsistence Act, which gave priority to rural residents, therefore complying with ANILCA. But this was short-lived, as the ruling of McDowell versus the state of Alaska resulted in the rural preference being unconstitutional. In terms of eligibility, the ruling has led to the current policy that all Alaskans are eligible for subsistence. Again, Alaska was out of compliance with Title VIII of ANILCA because of the rural priority conflict. In order for Alaska to come into compliance with the rural priority, the state needed to either amend its constitution or it needed to amend its constitution to allow rural priority, or changes to ANILCA by removing rural priority, or there needed to be a combination of both things. The state of Alaska failed to change its constitution in 1990 and has failed during every legislative session through 2009. The result of this was that the federal government took over managing subsistence activities on federal lands. It did not include federal waters. However, there were native elders who won a suit against the United States in 1992, saying that the ANILCA provisions for rural priority prevailed over federal waterways. In 1999, the federal government took over management of all federal waterways because the state failed to amend the Constitution to allow rural priority. By the federal government taking over management, this has restored the rural priority for many native subsistence activities throughout Alaska, including Tlingit lands and water. Since that time, a dual management approach to subsistence by the federal and state governments has been in place. Two different agencies are split in the management of Alaska's fish and game resources, which provides challenges not only for managers, but also for the users who have to work within two management systems. As late as 2002, Governor Knowles introduced draft legislation that would create a priority of customary and traditional subsistence uses in rural Alaska. The legislature ignored the draft legislation, and no other legislative action affecting rural priority has occurred since. Today, Alaska remains in dual management due to its state constitution being in conflict with provisions of ANILCA. The irony of this is that in the late 1960s, natives had pressed their valid claims of Aboriginal land title and used the oil pipeline to win a landmark settlement from Congress. ANCSA extinguished hunting and fishing rights, leaving subsistence without statutory protection. By the time ANILCA was passed, the political and social makeup of Alaska had changed, and the majority of Alaskans were urban people who wanted the fish and game. Conflicts with urban subsistence users and sport hunting users have made maintaining rural preference unattainable. The intent of ANILCA to establish a rural priority has been overshadowed by the roadblocks of so many people who want a part of Alaska's resources. It is my belief that one of the initial causes for conflict between the state and Native Alaskans is the omission of subsistence provisions in ANCSA. The state of Alaska needed to secure lands from the federal holdings, and in order to do this, subsistence needs had to first be determined. When ANCSA was being pushed forward by the oil companies, the Secretary of Interior would have needed to determine boundaries for the village's subsistence activities. This would be a daunting task, given the size and the remoteness of the state, and the nomadic nature of many traditional subsistence practices. With building of the oil pipeline, native needs were set aside for monetary gain by the oil companies. A significant amount of time and energy has been put into this issue of who may participate in subsistence and where subsistence may take place. Much of this may have been alleviated if the United States Congress would have completed ANCSA with the originally intended purpose of providing the right to a traditional way of life for all Native Alaskans. Throughout the evolution of laws related to subsistence, Native Alaskans have participated in subsistence. Subsistence is the mode by which the greatest value, respect, is taught. It is through subsistence that respect for animals, fish, and land elders, and family, and all others is taught by the elders and the family members to the youth. This I was told by Alice Bachman, a Yupik who was raised in a traditional home in Kipnuk, Alaska. She explained to me that the teaching of respect is so significant in her culture that the traditional value of these teachings for many individuals supersedes the laws that exist surrounding game and fish management. The traditional knowledge is often the priority in order to preserve the culture. Mrs. Bachman also expressed that many people in her village and neighboring villages know that there needs to be a set of laws to protect wildlife and fish resources. She pointed out that pre-contact native population numbers would not threaten resources. The fact that today we are able to move resources harvested into other trading economies can easily threaten wildlife populations. The connecting point in this discussion was that traditional subsistence is interfered with because of the greater overall need to manage a resource that is used beyond subsistence. Further, native subsistence is not given a true first priority in resource management. While talking with Tlingit elder Joe Hodge, parallel ideas about resource management came up. Mr. Hodge brought up how subsistence is not given first priority, yet state laws are written for subsistence to be last affected when reducing harvests. He was very emotional when he repeatedly stated that subsistence harvest is cut before other users harvest. This is evident in the Haines area by cycled closures of subsistence along with commercial fishing closures. These closures are to allow for escapement of fish to the spawning grounds. However, it is felt that the lesser number of returning fish that requires closing is due to non-subsistence harvesting. Mr. Hodge told numerous stories about people and animals and how we learn values from these animals. A story of he and his father watching a bear, raven, and an eagle on the shore eating fish was explained by his father as a lesson in how people should act by cooperating and respectfully sharing. This was likened to the moieties being represented by different animals and the representation of the animal behavior being of the moiety relationships. Mr. Hodge also told me of the salmon story and how the king salmon found their way up the Chilkat River for the first time, and he expressed how it was not the Department of Fish and Game or the state or the federal government. Rather, it was led up, the first Chinook was led up the Chilkat River by a Tlingit. These stories are a part of the cultural bonds in natives, and through a subsistence lifestyle, they are kept alive as methods to teach respect, values, and understanding to successive generations. Both Mrs. Bachman and Mr. Hodge stated that the small native population is not what burdens wildlife populations in most situations. Rather, it is the commercial use of resources and increased population that threatens wildlife populations, requiring more aggressive laws. The natives' respect for the importance of fish and animals in their culture is self-monitored by traditional environmental knowledge to ensure wildlife survival into the future, as it is critical for their own people's survival as well. Because of the effects of commercial and sport fishing industries, traditional subsistence users have been and continue to be negatively impacted with regulation. In areas where rivers are closed to subsistence during commercial harvest, the impact may be directly felt because traditional knowledge tells a person to harvest the fish when they are coming in greatest number, and the river may be closed to subsistence during the week of a strong salmon run. Other effects may be the closing of a subsistence season due to Chinook salmon being present with sockeye salmon. The Chinook are not returning to the river in acceptable management numbers, according to the State Fish and Game Department. Therefore, subsistence fishing has been curtailed to allow for escapement of Chinooks, even though the sockeye are the targeted subsistence species. This is another way that subsistence is being penalized first and not last, as the State Subsistence Act of 1978 calls for, according to Mr. Hodge. It is evident to me that Native Alaskans have had their traditional cultural practices altered by laws that may or may not have been intended to do so. The land and water provided this relatively small population of people with the needed resources for an independent subsistence lifestyle. It was the influx of primarily American settlers that changed the population dynamic, calling for regulation and management beyond the traditional ways. Boundaries changed greatly with statehood, and the cultural practice of absolute ownership conflicted with Native practices. Native people hold these traditional values in highest regard, as Mrs. Bachman and Mr. Hodge made clear to me. The constant struggle between practicing these traditions and the laws that regulate causes tension and anxiety. To comprehend what it is like to have been taught fundamental values that are to be carried through all life experiences, and then have a legal system that creates laws that limit, if not prohibit, practicing those traditional practices, is beyond my ability to comprehend. Having a more thorough understanding of the process that has gone into the evolution of these laws does give a framework for empathy and acknowledgement of these struggles.